pleasure to be here. I'm going to sort of move outside of the region into some of the work that we're doing. MWH is an engineering construction firm, been around for about coming up on our 200th anniversary. We're based in Denver, just outside Denver. Nice office park, beautiful view of the Continental Divide. And we just put in a P3 right outside our office window. It's the Denver-Boulder Turnpike, which was constructed over the last couple of years. Canadian investors came in and financed it, and it's just opened in the last couple of months. And so Colorado is a really healthy state right now for P3s. Both the governor and the mayor of Denver are big supporters of P3s, and there's a lot in progress right now. So it's in great contrast to what's going on in a lot of other parts of the country. And I work around the country, and I keep telling my friends in Denver, you guys are the P3 mecca, and they can't believe it, but they are right now. So why did MWH get involved in P3s? And actually, why did we launch the platform that I lead, which is called Infrastructure Development, Inc.? You can imagine, those of you guys from engineering construction firms, you can imagine going to the leadership team and saying, let's put together a development platform. You want to do what? But it's a risky thing. It's sort of out of character, and don't tell my bosses, but putting deals together is a lot of fun. It's a whole lot of fun. But the reason we put that together, and the reason the leadership team supported it, was because we saw this is inevitable, that there's going to be a change in the way that infrastructure projects are financed in the future, and there's going to be more private finance involved in it. And we'll get into that. You've heard a lot about it now, and I'll give you some of my wonky analysis here in a second. So the world's changing, and we wanted to get out in front of that. Through our work in the UK, we've been involved in P3 projects for years, and they privatized their water utilities, I think, during the Thatcher administration. And so a lot of the projects that are done in the UK right now in the water sector are more P3-like. But in the US, not at all. You have P3 activity going on with DOTs and other major municipalities, et cetera, organizations that have large staff that are really able to wrap their head around this new form of financing and start, putting their toes in the water. But most of the water projects, or most of the water agencies in the country, there's 55,000 water agencies in the US, so we haven't aggregated much at all. And they're very small, they're stretched on staff, they just aren't as familiar with this form of financing, so it presents some challenges, but it's coming in that sector. I find that, working around the country with river districts, municipalities, water agencies, that about 25% of them really want to go and try P3. About 50%, they're interested and they want to learn more about it. And then there's another 25% that say, no how, no way. There's no way that expensive private capital is going to work. But I'll go through some slides here in a second that sort of how we try to address that issue. Because when you're talking about what's the limit to more P3s, one of the big ones is the perception that the capital cost is high, and therefore the cost of services, the rates, whatever, are going to be much higher, and it's just not going to be a good deal for the constituents. In some cases, that's right. We don't think P3s fit for every project. We just think it's an option that ought to be out there and analyzed in conjunction with public financing. We saw a slide a little while ago about the 36% of projects, I think it was, that the Canadians have done and the 1% we have done. I mean, no fair comparing us to the Canadians. I mean, they're so nice and organized. We'll never be that way. But they rigorously, I think it's for any project over $100 million, it has to go through a process of analyzing whether it can be done as a P3. And there's a whole infrastructure that supports it at the provincial level, at the federal level. And the pension funds in Canada have been investing in infrastructure for a long time. And so it's pretty much the standard way of doing business. We're sort of the last ones, and as we said, it's the U.S. is the next big P3 market. It kind of reminds me of Brazil is always the country of the future. I hope we are going to be, because we can be a very, very large P3 market. So let's look at some of the slides. So that first slide that you're seeing right there is just, it's the gap in water infrastructure funding between now and 2040. So about over the next 20 years, and that comes from the American Society of Civil Engineers. I am just shocked and amazed that the ASCE thinks we need to spend more money on infrastructure. Just can't believe they think that, but they do. But there is a gap. I mean, who knows what the spread is, but there's a gap. And if the public sector can't meet those needs, the private sector is going to have to do it, because those are the only two sources of capital. Now, when we're talking about private capital, what are we talking about? We're talking about institutional money as opposed to individuals like us. Institutions or pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, it's billions of dollars out there that's invested on a routine basis in all sorts of financial assets. But we're really talking about the retirement savings of cops and school teachers and firefighters in large part. So it's sometimes managed by Wall Street, but the returns that are coming in are going to those retirement savings. And you've all heard about the challenge that the pension funds in this country are facing, especially since the financial crisis in 2008. And that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of interest in infrastructure. So, again, sorry for some of the color that got lost, but the basic message is still there. When we're talking about institutional money, again, pension funds, they invest just like you invest in your 401k. They've got portfolios that they allocate into equities, fixed income, and alternatives. They have more choices amongst alternatives than most of us do as individuals. You've probably got a REIT in your 401k. That's your version of an alternative asset. These guys who have to invest billions in that alternative class invest in things like private equity, hedge funds, and then real assets like real estate and infrastructure. And the whole move in this way sort of started with the Yale endowment about 30 years ago, and Yale was just knocking it out of the park in terms of getting returns on their portfolio, and everyone started going on, what's going on at Yale? What's David Swinson doing? And it turned out he had started moving into this asset class, and over the last 30 years, pension funds have moved more and more into this asset class. And in particular right now, there's a movement towards more allocation towards infrastructure. Why? Because it's utility risk for which you get utility returns. They're not getting anything out of their fixed income portfolio. We heard about that. I mean, you know where interest rates are as well as they do. And they can't allocate more to the equity portion of the portfolio because that increases its risk. So they have to move into new assets. So the point being is there's a ton of money that wants to move into infrastructure. So how is that money going to move in? It's going to move in through a commercial structure that's referred to as non-recourse project finance, which is just a funky way of saying that it's private money coming in, sometimes mixing with public money, and being managed by a special purpose company, the project company, to deliver the project. So let me walk through that for just a second, because I'm sure some of you know this cold, and some folks may not know it. But if you look at this graph right here, what you've got, like the guys who are running the parking meters for you, they've got a project company, I'm sure, that's managing that asset. And they were the ones who had the contract with the city of Chicago, or whoever, to provide that service. They raised the capital, delivered the project, now they're managing it. So that's the type of structure that's going to happen every time. Now, the reason I wanted to point that out is because I'm going to be getting into a very important point here in a minute, which is risk. Risk is a really cool subject, and risk transfer is even more interesting. But that's what's important to understand if you want to understand why there's actually a value proposition here. And it gets a little wonky, but trust me, if you can understand this, it sort of unlocks why this becomes a good public policy approach for delivering the infrastructure needs that the country has in front of it. So typically speaking, and here's that structure again, you're going to have a project development agreement that specifies exactly what that public sector entity wants and what it's willing to pay for that service. So this road, connecting these points with this kind of traffic flow, and we'll pay you X per year for the next 30 years for it. Or this water plant delivering so much water at a certain time of a certain quality, and we'll pay you X for it. So all that is specified up front. What also happens importantly is that through that agreement, the public sector transfers the risk of the project to that private entity, that project company, which is going to be capitalized with debt and equity, mostly from the private sector, perhaps a little extra public sector money too to help buy down the cost of capital, but the risk is going to that project company. So what happens if suddenly there's a cost overrun in that project in the 12th year? If it's a publicly funded project, that just means that the rates are going to go up because the users have to pay for that. In a privately financed project, what happens is the equity returns go down because the cost of operations has gone up. So the returns have gone down. So the equity absorbs that additional risk, they take that risk, and it isn't passed through in the rates typically. So it's things like that that are important to understand and that never get brought out in the media as to why there could be a good side to a P3 approach. Okay, when we're talking about risks, there's 3 alternative delivery platforms that we work with in our industry. There's others, but these are some of the main 3. Design, bid, build, which is the traditional delivery platform for municipal projects and water projects. And the risks that are over here, equipment failure, operations, change orders, legal disputes, et cetera, that's all borne by the public sector sponsor of that project. They try to pass those risks on to the service providers that deliver the project, but they're not always successful in doing that 100%, so a lot of that comes back in the form of increased rates to cover risks if they're realized. Design build was put together by the industry to start transferring more risk to the contractor. So the contractor provides a design build price and is responsible for designing and constructing the asset at that price and takes on that risk of things like change orders, legal disputes, design errors, et cetera, which used to reside with the public sector. With a P3, there you see it. Pretty much the only risk, with a few exceptions, is changes in law. The private sector can't manage the government changing a law. One of the first P3s we worked on was an LNG plant on the North Slope of Alaska to liquefy natural gas and to bring that gas down the ice highway to Fairbanks. And one of the risks was that the state might, 20 years from now, put a pipeline in. And so we couldn't guarantee we couldn't take that risk that the state would do that. So there was a provision in the concession agreement that would buy us out of that project if that indeed happened. But other than that, the project company I was showing you earlier takes on the risks of the project. Okay, so I've got 3 wonky slides, so just kind of take a deep breath. You guys want to stand up, but if you can get through these, you'll understand it. Just do something. Thank you. Yeah, good. Exactly. I heard once that Bill Gates' lawyer told him a long time ago that if you're in a meeting and with the software industry and someone starts talking about anything that sounds like collusion, knock over a glass of water and just say, just remember, I didn't agree to that. And then knocking over the glass of water was to make sure everybody remembered what he said after he did that. Okay. So 3 wonky slides, I promise, but that's it. All right, so let's talk about it for a second. You've got risks associated with the project. Somebody's got to bear those risks and pay the consequences if that risk manifests itself in the project. So let's just take, and when you do these projects, as my colleagues know, you have reams and reams and reams of what we call risk registers of everything that could go wrong and how you price that. So this is a simplified version of it. Let's just say a design delay, right? Okay, so if it happens, it's going to cost $3 million. If its probability of happening is 30%, so the probability adjusted cost or risk, right, that's a mouthful, but you can follow that, is $900,000. Okay, so you do that for everything. And you've got that pricing, probability adjusted cost or risk for all the risks associated with the project. Now, if you're going to publicly fund the project, so the public's, going to the capital markets, raising municipal debt, and then overseeing the design, construction, and then the operations of that project. There's 37 risks that we just went through that have different probabilities of occurring. How many people in here know what a Monte Carlo analysis is? Okay, how many of you guys have gotten on the Vanguard or Fidelity or whatever website and said, if I got this much money today and I save this much money, what's the probability that I'll have enough to retire on? And you get that spread saying, there's a 5% probability you'll be worth $20 million, and there's a 10% probability you'll be in the hole, but you'll probably be worth this. Have you seen those? That's a Monte Carlo. What that's doing is running all the different scenarios of the future of what could possibly happen in terms of returns in the market, et cetera, and then generating the most probable outcome from that. This was a technique developed during the Manhattan Project, and it isn't like it's nuclear science, but it's just a way of measuring outcomes and the probability of outcomes. So, okay, here's the point. If you have all those risks associated with the project, some which could add to the cost of the project, and that's the risk to the public, and you run the Monte Carlo on all those risks, you see that if everything goes right with this project, over the life cycle of this project, say 30 years, it's going to cost $600 million to get the services from that project. So what's that, about $20 million a year? If everything goes wrong, it's going to cost $740,000 or $740 million. So you get it. If no risks manifest themselves, it's not going to cost much. If every risk you can imagine manifests itself, it's going to cost a lot. And the most probable cost is right there in the middle. Now, I guarantee you, anybody in here who's in the public sector has seen that right side of that curve a lot before. All right, now, in a privately financed project, all those risks got transferred to the project company I was telling you about. So that's the way the distribution looks for a privately funded project. Why? So if everything goes wrong, or everything goes right, it's $660 million. If everything goes wrong, it's $680 million. Why is it such a narrow spread? It's because in that contract I was telling you about between the public entity and the project company, everything's been specified about who's responsible for covering what risks and what the cost of service is going to be from that asset over the life of that asset. So there's only so big a spread. There's only a few risks that can be passed through to the public in that contract, and if all those happen and get passed through, that's when you'll get that right side of that bell curve. Now let's overlay those. All right, last wonky slide, but this is the important part of it. Yes, because the private capital is more expensive, a little more expensive, it's generally most probably going to have a higher cost of service, see where the peaks are, the two curves, over the life of that project. But look at everything that could go wrong on the right side of that curve, where even if you went with private finance, it could cost more to have gone with public financing. So I guess to wrap this is that it's not inherently a bad deal for the public to have private financing for infrastructure projects. It's not. It needs to be assessed and analyzed, and if all the risks are managed well by the public sector, you probably should go with public funding. But if there's a shortage of capital or risks can't be managed, or you want to have more certainty about what the rates are going to be, there's a lot of room for private financing. And I know this is kind of like drinking from a fire hydrant, but it's the most important part here because this is totally lost in the debate. And this is the sort of thing that is key to opening up the floodgates to the private capital that could help America meet its infrastructure needs. There's no shortage of capital out there. There's just a shortage of good projects and a shortage of sort of understanding how to bridge that gap and create value for the public by using that private capital.